So my name's Alan Berube. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings, and more importantly, I'm Elizabeth's co-author. I'm very proud about that fact, and so pleased to have been part of this venture for the last several years. So I want to start, of course, with an advertisement, which is to buy the book. It is available outside. It is a real, tangible thing. This is in the electronic age, as Stro was mentioning. This is hard to believe. I actually got a thing last week in a box, and it had my name on it, and Elizabeth's name too. So I hope you all will take the advantage of buying it, or you can download it onto your Kindle or your iPad or what have you. We will sign it if you like, unless you're afraid that would devalue it, in which case we won't do that. Once again, I'll advertise our website, which is www.confronting, there it is, confrontingsuburbanpoverty.org. We've put together a whole host of materials that, if you don't want to read the whole book, extract some of the real tangible value out of that, and hope to spread some of this research and messages across the country. If you forget the website, it's on the side of the pens. You can get a pen outside, too. There's a lot of swag going on here. And then finally, you can keep the conversation going today on Twitter, #SuburbanPoverty, one word. OK, so I may have the most challenging job of the day, which is to expose everyone here and on the webcast to the brilliance of our three panelists and do it under 1 hour. And I won't do them justice, but I hope you can get a glimpse of what they know and the value that they're providing in their communities today and around these issues, I hope, starting today on the national level. I won't give you their full bios in light of our limited time here. You can find them in your packets, but I'll say a word about each of them in the process of asking the first question. Finally, I want to say that Elizabeth and I, over the process of writing this book over a few years, we visited a lot of regions around the country, some of the dots that you saw on the map earlier there. And when it came time to pick 3 people for this panel, 3 organizations in 3 places that really represented what we regarded to be innovation on this issue, it took us about 15 seconds, I'd say. Unfortunately, none of those people could be here today, so we got these 3. I'm joking. This is exactly who we thought of. So with that, I want to talk here with Joe Neary from IFF, Mary Furtakis from the Tukwila School Board in Washington, and Angela Blanchard from Neighborhood Centers in Houston. So I want to begin the discussion by helping our audience understand a little bit about the communities in which you all work. What sorts of changes you've actually seen going on there over the past decade or more? To the extent you can do that in 2 or 3 minutes each, that'd be great. So maybe, Mary, I could start with you on this question. So you serve, as I said, as the director of the school board for Tukwila, Washington. It's a city of about 20,000 people, I think, just on the south side of Seattle. You also recently served as the president of the Washington State School Directors Association. So you have a lot of experience in thinking about these issues from a statewide level and a policy level as well. So if you would, could you paint sort of a brief portrait of Tukwila and some of the communities in South King County, the changes that are taking place and what that's meant for schools there in particular?
Thank you, Alan. I'd be happy to share. Tukwila and the Roadmap region is, as you heard a little bit earlier, an extremely diverse community. It's not official, but we're a refugee immigrant resettlement area. So coming to Tukwila is the first stop for many of the families that we serve. And Tukwila itself is only about 3,000 students, and we have over 70 languages spoken, if you can imagine. And over 60% of our student body who do not speak English as their first language, coming from wherever you've read about. Basically, in sum, if you've read about something in the paper happening internationally, in all likelihood, students from that country will be in our school district within 10 months. So our latest influx has been from Burma, Bhutan, and Nepal. And so we fluctuate back and forth on who's coming in and what their needs are. And it's extremely challenging, but it's also a really beautiful thing that happens because there's not a majority of any particular group. And so for my own children, they've had a very unique experience. I'm Caucasian, but my Caucasian children are minorities. My son is a senior at our local high school, and he represents about 18% of the student population. And for, as a student who actually speaks English as his first language and Caucasian, that's about 15%. That just gives you an idea of what that's like. The changes that we've seen, it's really become a majority-minority school district in a very short period of time and is reflective of what's happening in our region. You can, when Alan came out to visit, one of the things that they saw on the wall of our high school are all of the homecoming queens and kings for a number of years. And in 1990, we had the first homecoming queen of color. And it is such a stark line from prior to that to what has happened this year. And this year's homecoming queen and king were from Ethiopia and Bosnia. So it's a really graphic depiction of what's happening. Again, challenges, but at the same time, so many assets because of our size and the fact that we are now working collaboratively, which I know we'll get into a little bit more, but this just gives you a bit of an idea of what our region is looking like.
That's terrific. Thanks, Mary. Maybe I could turn to Angela next. You represent a region of growing diversity as well. You're president and CEO of Neighborhood Centers. It's the largest nonprofit in Texas. They do everything bigger in Texas, so that's saying something if you're the biggest one. You serve about 400,000 people each year throughout the region, over 60 locations, a really wide range of services and support. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the places that you're serving across that region, both urban and suburban, and whether you think there are really any important distinctions between your city locations and your suburban locations in terms of the needs and challenges there.
Thanks. Well, first, I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be here in D.C. and hear a conversation open with nice things being said about somebody we elected in Texas. So it is 50 years old, but still, the news was good. I think that the most surprising thing for folks outside of Houston is learning that our city became the nation's most diverse city. So, and it didn't become the most diverse city by having people arrive from all over the world, just like Mary's story, all over the world, filled with aspirations and settling squarely in the center of Houston. They came and they settled everywhere that housing was affordable. And so when I was asked recently, what's the difference between the suburbs, the work you're doing in the suburbs, versus the work you're doing in the immigrant community? I said, well, if you've been in Houston, then you know Houston is an immigrant community. Our region is a vast magnet for people with aspirations who believe that through their own hard work, their hopes and dreams can be realized. So the most important part of today's presentation for me is the discussion about how people are connected out of neighborhoods into those larger regional opportunities. Because you might be generating the jobs as we are in Texas. You might be providing what you can in terms of the market-related opportunities. But if people are cut off from those, isolated in any way, then those jobs will go unfilled and the poverty will persist. So we are an economic powerhouse in Houston. We are proud of that. We worked for it. What we want, though, is that promise that we make in this country to be realized in Houston, to be connected to each neighborhood that we serve, all 73 of them. So I think that this is a powerful book. I think there's a couple of really brave people to take on geography, demographics, and economy all in one book, and to look at the nexus of that. So it's a very, hugely useful book, and we thank you for it.
Thanks, Angela. Brave or foolish, depending upon how you look at it. That's terrific. Joe.
Time will tell.
That's right. Joe, so you're CEO of IFF, as Elizabeth described, formerly the Illinois Facilities Fund. I joke, I don't know if this is just my joke, it's like KFC, right? It used to be Kentucky Fried Chicken, now it's just KFC. You're a little healthier than they are, I think.
There's no fry.
Formerly known as.
But you do a lot of different things, right? You are a strategic advisor, you're a real estate developer, you're a community development financier for affordable housing, charter schools, child care facilities. And you've been active now in cities and suburbs across 5 different states in the Midwest. So I'm wondering what you see through your work that maybe puts this suburban issue into a broader context. We sort of went from one community to one region, and now you're in a whole bunch of regions. And so I'm wondering how you're seeing this in the places where you work.
So we do play over a 5-state space, and there's just so many similarities between a Chicago, a St. Louis, a Milwaukee, and Indianapolis, a Kansas City. And those cities and metropolitan areas all have so much more in common than they do because you're in Illinois or Indiana or Wisconsin. A lot of our deepest work is done in Chicago. And Chicago is a meld of a couple of the things that we discussed, right? There's this push as we rethink public housing in the city of Chicago, and we encourage people to go find jobs. And many of the jobs were in the suburbs of the Chicago metropolitan area. And so people began, began to move out to where employment was. And that obviously raised a number of challenges. But the second part of that was we have immigrants also in Chicago, many in the Latino community. They started by a port of entry really in the city of Chicago and then began to expand out following jobs. But now directly move, new immigrants coming directly to those communities. But what they find, and this is true in St. Louis, this is true in Milwaukee, what they find is there's no infrastructure that really deals with some of the issues that they have. We got so involved in this over 10, 12 years ago in work around early education, where some of the greatest need in the Chicago metropolitan area was not in the city of Chicago, but we're in suburbs all around the metropolitan area. And in some ways, Mary talks about this, as the school districts were the canaries in the coal mine, because they were getting kids into the kindergarten, first and second grade without any kind of Head Start prep or early ed prep, but also really dealing with the fact that they just hadn't built any infrastructure. So our work was really about beginning that process, and that plays out in upper education, it plays out in healthcare, and it certainly plays out in the whole human services safety net.
For any of you, it sounds like what you were seeing in your regions was present long before the recession. Has the recession changes, it just magnified it, and what do you think is going to happen when the recovery sets in? Is this structural? Is it cyclical? How do you view it?
The recession definitely had an impact. I mean, the changes were taking place. We were trying to establish some support networks for the different groups coming in, getting better at how to work with the different ethnic groups and different cultures and needs. And then the recession really did have a major impact. One of the things we've seen in our area, in our school district, we are at almost 9% homeless for our students. Those are students we can identify, so we know it's higher than that. And homelessness brings up a whole other set of issues that you have to address related to housing and transportation and health and human services and all of the other things that families are dealing with when you're in that type of a situation. The other thing we found is that while we've always had a high mobility rate, in fact what happened was people were combining together living in a house so that they could meet the mortgage. So in my particular neighborhood, it's not at all unusual to see 6, 7, or 8 cars in the driveway, and it makes it very difficult to then predict how many students are going to be coming in. There's no formula that's a 2.2 per house that we can go off of. What we're starting to see, though, is with the recovery, is that now that housing prices are starting to go up a little bit, it's now going to cause the mobility to go up because people are going to be priced out again.
So let me turn to what it is you all do. So we've advanced this notion today in the conversation in the book that you all are doing something different maybe than what's going on in the rest of America. Something that's a little bit more scaled to the magnitude of the issues facing cities and suburbs today. So I want to, find out if that's true, and then B, get you to talk a little bit about what that something is that's different and that maybe we all should be looking at a little bit more carefully as to how we bring that to other places. So Angela, your organization's, I guess it's a century old now or maybe more, largest nonprofit in Texas, but it wasn't like that when you started. So how did you reach the scale that you're at today? What did it take to be effective as you grew for the communities that you're trying to serve? And what's important about the scale that you have today for meeting the goals of your organization and your communities? That's a small
Where
question.
does-
Yeah, where do you start? Yeah.
So actually, here's really at the heart of the story is one has to think about what does it take to really build an evolutionary organization. Because organizations, human services organizations that are married to, tied to, committed to one service, one locale, one demographic, one project, tend to organize to hang on to that. And when the world changes and the geography shifts and the economy is different, then that process of working and evolving with it is hard to do. So what does it take to be evolutionary in a siloed world in which every policy, every funding source, every grant is written for a particular locale, for a particular demographic, for one dimension of what it takes to create neighborhoods of opportunity for people? It takes a lot of hard work. Well, let me just say, you got to milk every cow, right? I'm going to try to class that up a little bit. Really, you have to learn to work with all of the siloed funding sources and policies. You have to take anything that's available, put it together in a way, it's a bit of alchemy within the organization in a way that really meets the needs for the people that whose potential you want to have realized. One of the other things that we're being noticed for a lot is an extremely important shift from a perspective on poor neighborhoods as places where we study problems, analyze those problems, and roll out a fix. So to be an evolutionary organization, you have to be fed by the aspirations of the people that you're trying to reach. So we see people not as the problems, poverty not as the problem, but people as the resource and the potential that has to be realized. So the whole region moves forward. One of the other commitments you have to make, and this is a leadership commitment, it's an organizational commitment, is you're going to have to do this longer than anybody's going to fund you for it. Somebody's going to go in with you. They're not going to be there for the day that that neighborhood is completely changed and transformed. You have to be in it for the long haul, and you have to stick with it. And as the funding changes and what becomes popular, we're all about place-based. That has about another minute and a half, and then we'll be about something else. But in reality, every neighborhood needs a school where people are proud to send their children. Everyone needs a financial institution they trust. You want a clinic you can go to. Let's don't imagine that poor neighborhoods have to be studied, have to be worked with in some radically different way. What we have to do is take all the siloed ways that things are supported and put them together to create the same kind of neighborhood for people, low-income families, that all families want to live in. And so I think that's what people are noticing more, that we've figured out how to take all this siloed funding and craft something more holistic and more integrated.
Yeah, no, and I think that's, this notion of the evolutionary organization, right, and the folks who are committed to doing more than one thing in more than one place over time is, when Elizabeth talked about the quarterback, I mean, pick your favorite metaphor. It's a quarterback, it's an orchestra conductor, it's a
that
sweeper.
One is completely lost on me. Yeah. No aptitude for sports, but
that's you, right.
I take it it's a good thing to be a quarterback.
It is, and I think, Joe, you're aiming to be that sort of quarterback, that evolutionary organization as well. And again, when you started 25 years ago, you were a small community loan fund in Chicago. So tell us a little bit about your evolution, sort of what pushed you in these new communities, and to what Angela was talking about, how you be scaled and yet local and rooted in local places at the same time.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that challenge very specifically. So our evolutions, we were a $2 million loan fund, and we really were developed to meet the capital needs of nonprofits. And, and we built that organization on that principle for a number of years. But what we found considerably was that capital was just part of a solution. And so if you didn't have an agency that was growing in a community, say childcare in the suburbs, nobody was coming to you for an application for capital. So we evolved into also becoming a real estate development company for nonprofits, or a CDC, if you will, for nonprofit organizations, to assist them to kind of plan, conceptualize, and think about developing infrastructure for serving communities of need. And part of that evolutionary process after that was, well, okay, so you can do that. where's the greatest need? And that really brought us very deeply into this question about suburban poverty, because so much of the need seemingly was in the city of Chicago, when in fact it was all over the metropolitan area. And so we developed a research group to begin analysis in terms of thinking about need in a different way across multiple spaces. Early education was part of that. Now we do a lot around school performance. The numbers in Chicago are staggering when you move into the suburbs and look at city performance. In many of the inner ring suburbs, the schools actually perform much worse than some of the worst schools in Chicago, but yet the bright light of Chicago drowns out that and just creates so much noise. So we've evolved into a place, as Angela said, we have to think comprehensively. It can't just be childcare, it can't just be affordable housing. Much of the community development world that we exist was all about affordable housing and economic development. IFF actually grew out of a place of human services, education, healthcare, and later evolved into affordable housing and economic development. So we've kind of met in the middle. And if we think about healthy communities, strong communities, as Angela just said, it has all of those components. So our job is to be able to be nimble enough to have capital to make it happen, have technical expertise to make it happen, but also to be informed by facts. Because I think Luis was talking so eloquently, is that if we're not dealing with facts, it gets very difficult to use very scarce resources wisely.
Yeah, and one of our dirty little secrets is that Elizabeth did that with you guys when she worked for IFF many years ago. And
but on the scale issue, I mean, we're a financial institution. Scale is very important, and the CDFIs have grown significantly across the country. But it takes scale to work in that space, and so we were the Illinois Facilities Fund. We became IFF because we expanded to a number of states. And have grown to be a significant financial institution, but it gives us the power to really pull funds, not just from government. In fact, our government funding is very small, but it's a unique program, the CDFI fund, because it's small, very small amounts of money that leverage very large amounts of private capital. So we really look at that as a smart government investment that pulls in other capital, but it's done best at scale.
Yeah. And scale is something I want to come to you around, Mary, too, because there's no, I mean, not to my knowledge at least, you don't have Angela or a Joe working in South King County. Washington, you guys have tried to find scale in a different way by getting together in this initiative that Elizabeth alluded to called the Roadmap Project. It's a collaboration, a collective action project among 6 suburban school districts plus the City of Seattle Public Schools. Is that as unnatural an act as it sounds like? And what got you all there to that same table in the search of a sort of shared goal setting and solutions?
I'm really glad you asked, and I do want to say that we do have a quarterback. I have to give some props to Mary Jean Ryan, who is the executive director of CCER and who I really credit with pulling this together. Her background was she was a policy director for the mayor of Seattle and had a lot of connections, and seeing what the issues were from an urban setting and having a bigger vision for looking at data. I mean, the data is so compelling for the needs. King County, for those of you who are not familiar with it, at the north and east end of it, that's home of Microsoft's corporate headquarters. And then you've got South King County on the other end of the spectrum. And so the gap in the same county where you're 25, 30 minutes away it's staggering when you look at the resources and what's there. So I do consider her a quarterback, but what has happened is that there were a lot of people out there and organizations seeing the issues, but we didn't have a way to come together as an umbrella, like a neighborhood centers. So the amazing thing to me is we really just launched in 2010, in the middle of the recession. But we got together with the superintendents of the 7 school districts and the community college presidents, meet monthly, and they're streamlining the process for our high school students to be able to get into the community colleges. The school boards in the 7 districts have all signed resolutions supporting this, the mayors of our cities. I mean, it's truly a collective impact project where we have work groups looking at cradle to career. And people who are drawn and passionate about and have training, or not necessarily, they're interested in the different areas, birth to third grade, K through 12, ELL, data, high school to college transition, parent engagement. All of those work groups exist, and for me, it's exciting because each time we have a quarterly meeting, there are more people there who are being drawn in as there's a way that they can take their passion and what resources they have within their organizations or the networks they have to contribute to what is a very exciting element. And yes, it is non-intuitive on some levels, but for me, because I've been a school board director for 18 years, and it's become very clear to me that I can have the best policies in the world, but I'm not going to get the educational attainment I want for my students and their academic success unless the policies related to housing, transportation, human services are in alignment, so that the kids walking in my door aren't having to worry about where they're going to sleep that night and where the next meal's coming from, and they can actually be there because they don't have a chronic toothache that's contributing to an absentee rate. All of those things have to take place for schools to be able to accomplish their mission at a high level. So for me, seeing that and looking at our mobility along the Interstate 5 corridor, the kids are moving back and forth across our district lines. So from my perspective, those lines are fairly arbitrary. And we have to look at all of our students as our kids. Yeah. And as soon as you take that perspective that these are our kids, no matter which district they're in, if we're committed to their success and their family's success, you're going to do what the Roadmap Project is doing.
Right, yeah. So I'm glad I think you're bridging us to an important sort of policy conversation. So I'd like to ask you all, maybe you need to just suspend disbelief for a minute and imagine that Washington was actually poised to do something other than hold hearings about the IRS or leaks or whatever. What if we wanted to make the sorts of changes that you're making in your communities more the norm rather than the exception in terms of how we address poverty in cities and suburbs across the country? I want to sort of get your thoughts about what that would, what you're experiencing on the other end, and then sort of what that would look like to turn it into a more coherent system. So maybe I could start with you, Joe, and Angela already talked about the silos, and I know you see the silos from where you're sitting as well. Is the scale and the ability to knit these things together in a creative way to blend technical assistance and research and strategic advice and financing and development, is that something that you feel like federal or state policy really values? Is this something they could value more explicitly, and how would you like to see them do that?
Well, I do think that theoretically they certainly would value it, and I think that the whole conversation in community development is moving in that direction. And I think there's some promising programs coming out of HUD that is trying to weave those things together. But some of the most exciting things, I think, is Mary's Roadmap project is about bringing jurisdictions together. And in Chicago, the Metropolitan Planning Council brought 5 municipalities to work together around affordable housing. And the programs are just they're not made to work across 5 municipalities. They're not, you were telling me a story about, 3 groups coming together, and the work is all about, has to be done on an individual basis. So I think that one area where federal policy and state policy really could start to move is to encourage this kind of collaboration, because the challenge working in the suburbs is, in Chicago, we're dealing with 290 of them, right? So when they collaborate and work together, which creates a scale for something like affordable housing, and hopefully we'd like to expand this in more kind of ideas around community development and of course in education, you shouldn't be penalized. And I think that that's one of that is a policy change that doesn't cost a lot of money, if anything, that could really kind of move this conversation forward.
Yeah, some of these, right, and we chronicle some of this in the book, and it's strange and perverse, but I don't know, you've been at it for a while, you see this too, Angela, right? I mean, what are the costs, the sort of human and financial costs associated with trying to deal with the 35 programs and the 40 different data systems? What could be done to make those processes easier, short of just like cutting Angela Blanchard a big check for her to do God's work with?
So I was imagining if Washington actually got to work and tried to simplify things for us, And I pictured, when that happens, for example, with tax policy, when Washington makes it, simplified, how much more difficult it gets. So I'm terrified of answering this question. And for fear that something would get done, we've just now figured out how to work with all of this. And if you improve it, heaven help us. So I think, let me just tell you, this is the challenge, this is the urgency I feel. If I'm someone living on $32,000 a year for my family in a suburb of Houston today, and I have the jobs, more than one it takes to assemble that amount of income, I cannot wait for anything that's going to happen here, or anything that's going to happen in the way of policy, or anything that's going to happen at the national level in a national foundation for my future, because it's not coming in time. And when it arrives, it won't be pinpointed and targeted the way it would work best. That's sadly true. So the value of having strong organizations is to figure out how to use what will come and to make that work. And I think those points get made in the book. Yes, we pay a really high price to feed bureaucracy, data that no one ever looks at. What we long for is if the federal government acted as a value investor, and we could say the three things that people are working for the hardest: to increase their income, to see their children succeed at school, to belong and be connected to their neighbors. Now, we measure those because that's what the people we work with care about. Judge us on that. Fund us or not when we achieve or don't achieve that. We imagine a world in which we sit before people asked to deliver the thing that matters most to the people that we work with, and that we're rewarded with doing more work if we get it done. Now, in the meantime, there's somebody in a neighborhood in Houston who came to our region with hopes and dreams, believing that the best place to plant those was right there in Houston, Texas. And our job is to connect them, whatever it takes. I recently listened to a national foundation. And I will have to say, I think in every way, many communities in this country feel overlooked. It is so precious to me to see the work that Brookings has done around this map of what our city now looks like, because all of the other maps of where you invest to help people never looked anything like our city. So a million times we were overlooked for support when we really needed it. And so I thank you for that, because we've got this new map now, and I think it's going to help us as we go forward. So I think changes. Make value investments. Hold us accountable for things that matter. If we've been doing it decades and it's turned out well, give us a break on the 90 million reports that we churn out that no one ever looks at. Those are dreams. In the meantime, we really do have to make it work. And that means working together and building strong collaborative relationships and putting the goals and the aspirations of the people we serve right at the center of the work.
Is there, Mary, is there something about the Roadmap Project and the recent Race to the Top district competition where you received a significant grant? I mean, is there a silver lining here? Is it that kind of outcome-focused, valuing sort of collaboration and real goal setting coming out of the Department of Education? Is that, do you feel like it's getting at some of these issues that Joe and Angela are identifying? And is it a model for how we could address other policy arenas like housing or transportation?
The simple answer is yes and no. Definitely Angela's point about the bureaucracy, the reports, that takes a lot of time. And we hear a lot about accountability, particularly in schools. But what's forgotten is that accountability is supposed to be two-way. Yeah. And the accountability at this point is it's on the schools. But there's some accountability from the federal government and our state governments to also be making this investment in our children, in our communities by adequate funding. So that part I haven't seen that much of. I see declining resources and increased demands for the reporting. And as you mentioned very eloquently in the book, a lot of the rules seem to be made for the 1% that isn't doing what they're supposed to, and the 99% of us sitting here and listening to the webcast and in other places who are trying to do the work, it's like, why are these barriers being put up and impeding sincere efforts to try and improve communities? Now, for the Race to the Top grant, there is no denying that resources matter. And getting a $40 million grant for the 7 of us to do 3 things that we've identified, which is, we're calling it Start Strong, which is a focus on birth to 3rd grade, Stay Strong, which is the high school to college career transition, and STEM Strong, because we really want to be able to tap into all of the wonderful job opportunities related to STEM fields. So the excitement around that is, we already had the work plans in place. It was now, how are we going to do it? So to have that infusion is really exciting for all of us to be able to figure out how we can collaborate even more. So don't let anyone tell you that resources aren't important. They are. And you know, again, there are probably ways to make things perhaps more efficient, and some collaborative efforts can definitely help that. But my main point would be, before you do these policies, talk to the people who are actually going to be implementing them, and the ones who are on the ground who will be doing the work. Because you can have a great policy over here and you can have a great outcome you want, but this piece in the middle with the implementation is where everything happens, and it's going to be successful or not if based on the actual involvement of those doing the work.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, one could argue that that kind of consultation and discovery is even more important in the context of some of the communities that you're all working in and a part of. They may have assumptions about how this stuff works, informed by 50 years of waging the war on poverty in cities, and have very little understanding of what this stuff looks like in a suburban municipality that actually doesn't really have a housing department or doesn't really have a social services function. Is that, I mean, is that,
I think
that resonate with you? Is that, I mean, do things look, do they make assumptions about how things work in your places that are really at odds with the kinds of places these are?
Yeah, I think the assumptions get made about how they work and also about how they ought to work, and neither of those things applies. And I think, I mean, people have asked me, for example, what's the difference between how you work in suburban communities versus how you work in immigrant communities? Well, that would be one and the same. So not that we work the same, but those are one and the same in Houston. So I think that old map really needs to be set aside, and we waged a war on poverty that talked about what we did not want. I think that the conversation that this book can spawn is about what we do want, and really that is a stronger system of connections, a more integrated approach, a way literally of having someone living in a neighborhood being able to reach those broader opportunities. So we have to keep talking about how that bridge gets built, and it needs to be built from both ends. So one important point, we can't finance what we want to do the way we finance the old programs. I said, so new financing models, what Joe is talking about, what Joe's done, the new financing models are essential. All money's not created equal. And so money, the real leverage off of private sector money, when you can put public sector, private sector, and nonprofit together, that three-legged stool actually achieves a great deal more that is sustainable than any one of those legs or any one silo. So those are things I think that financing for and how it looks when it really works is something worth looking at as well, and getting the leverage off the enormously important private support that is, generally speaking, not always, somewhat more flexible and responsive, and that's a very worthwhile thing to come back to, because all these dreams don't happen if the money doesn't flow the way
I completely say, I mean, this is the ability to some federal money, move it out of government into the hands of intermediaries who have to be accountable for it. So leverage, on a leveraging side, but to be able to use it in ways that are meaningful locally. And there are many programs actually that Washington does that actually fit this bill. I mean, the Department of Education has this tiny little program called the Credit Enhancement Program for Charter School. I mean, it's so small, it is a rounding error on a good day. And yet, this money goes out to intermediaries, CDFIs, some state associations, and they use it to credit enhance kind of some private Wall Street, bond debt, et cetera. Myriad ways, all that are vital for that locality. So our $12 million that we've put into this program has already been leveraged to $220 million worth of charter facilities. So there are so many ways for Washington to move money in an innovative basis. And I do think that this bridges this conversation of the gridlock in Washington, because it is about outcomes, it is about leveraging, it is about collaboration that isn't done in a smart way. But if that same program was, you shall do this, it won't work in the same way in Chicago, Houston, and Seattle. So that's, clearly I think we have got to think about flexibility to get that, to use scale but be very local.
That's great, and I'm always appreciative when you help us define our future research agenda too. So, so a real focus on these issues, I think, must be the next wave of what we do. I just want to take about maybe 10 minutes for questions. Let's go to. I'll introduce him, George McCarthy from the Ford Foundation. Hey, Mac.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I'm George McCarthy from the Ford Foundation, and so I want to go back to a point Alan made a little bit ago, where he kind of described at least the Seattle experience, but I would say probably all of you, as kind of unnatural occurrences. Because one of the things that I think we're confronting here is the fact that, especially in the nonprofit community, it's not driven by an evolutionary logic that like drives market-based institutions. And so then the question becomes, what is it that drives the evolution of organizations that, for some reason, voluntarily choose to change their focus from narrow geographies to broader geographies? And I'm wondering also why it is that we haven't talked at all about regional planning as being an element in driving that evolution. Because in some ways, the experiment the Obama administration started with the Sustainable Communities Initiative is one way for us to begin to kind of explode geography and say maybe we have to think differently about our institutional arrangements to deal with whatever the problems are we're trying to deal with. And yet, I don't know, we haven't been discussing that yet today.
Well, yeah, so maybe that is a question. Is there anything about the way that the federal government has been acting more recently that has been part of this evolutionary process of your organizations and your initiatives, specifically around regional planning issues? And if the answer is no, that's okay.
So we're working in those 5 communities that I discussed, as 5 suburban community, inner ring suburbs, and we received a Sustainable Communities grant. And it was actually made because there was a collaboration amongst different communities. We are focused around kind of transit-oriented development. There's a number of train lines that go through a serious foreclosure crisis in these communities. So IFF is operating a program to think theoretically on a planning basis of using the collaboration, doing the foreclosure rehabilitation around all of the transit-oriented space, creating a transit-oriented development fund that will then fund further affordable housing in and around those communities. And it's working fairly well. Now, the challenge is that the planners in HUD are fabulous on the grand idea, but when we get to then the finance side of what we do, this TOD fund, I don't want to say it's a nightmare, but it's a lot of like wanting to prescribe each and every piece of this financing because they don't necessarily have an understanding of finance. So we do have to challenge ourselves to be more interdisciplinary. We're doing it. And we need government to be able to do that also. So, and that can be very challenging. I go back to that Department of Ed program. The Department of Ed doesn't do any finance of stuff. But they very specifically worked with some consultants to create out a framework for how finance should be. But ultimately, it was all about outcomes. Give us leverage, do charter schools, do it quickly, and if you do those things, we don't care how you arrange the interest rates or how you use the credit enhancement or whether you do bonds or whether you do new markets tax credits. We don't care. Get us the leverage. It's a beautiful, simple program that then has had a huge outcomes across the country.
And Mary, was there any history of real collaboration among the municipalities in South King County prompted by planning or any other policy imperative?
Well, we had a potential impending disaster that had everyone, the Howard Hansen Dam, which was having some issues, and had that flooded the valley, that would have been an economic disaster for this entire country. People don't realize how much takes place in that valley. So the municipalities did work together on some emergency prep, and that was also in the last couple of years. So some of those relationships were there. So we're all adjacent, but again, as it's mentioned in the book, municipalities have their own thing. School districts have their own thing. And if nothing else, the recession has made it very clear that we can't continue operating that way. The resources will probably never be the way they were before, and the only way we're really going to meet community or regional goals is if we are developing those types of collaborations. Unfortunately, sometimes it does take something negative to happen to promote what is the Chinese thing about crisis and opportunity. It's the same character. And I would say that, unfortunately, that may be the way things have to happen. But I also think that in Washington, and because I'm 3,000 miles away, I guess I can say this, things that should be pretty basic, which is not the same as easy, get lost. And I'll take an example of housing. If the student that starts with me on the first day of school is there with me the last day of school, you have just addressed a ton of issues. Why can we not have policies to have that one thing happen? It's basic, it might not be easy, but those are the kinds of things that need to happen. So I guess it'd be nice to just have people look at, here are the things, here's the outcome we really want, and is there the collective will to get there? Yeah. I mean, these wonderful people are doing it in their communities. It's possible. It shouldn't be the exception.
Maybe take another question back there.
Yeah. Greg Squires from George Washington University. I also grew up in the eastern suburbs of Cleveland in the 50s and 60s and later spent several years on the board of the Woodstock Institute in Chicago. It seems to me poverty was never more invisible than when it was even more concentrated in central cities and suburban commuters drove downtown to their downtown jobs on expressway, bypassing these communities altogether. And it's still today that poverty is much higher in central cities than it is the suburbs. So my question to anybody in the panel is, what do you think of the merits or demerits of programs like GETRO or Moving to Opportunity or the Mount Laurel program, other efforts to try to help low-income folks move to low poverty, high opportunity neighborhoods, often in the suburban ring?
Well, I'll speak to that. I think that this has been federal policy. I mean, we're trying to create mixed income communities. We're trying to encourage people to go to jobs. So I don't think anybody here is saying that we shouldn't have programs like that. I think the questions that we're raising is that while that is one policy, the history of our policies dealing with poverty haven't evolved to be one that is suburban focused, right? So when Head Start works off every Head Start person knows it's 34 kids. It's 17 in the morning, 17 in the afternoon. It's 5 classrooms. It's all concentrated poverty. It all works when you're at a public housing project like Robert Taylor Homes. It's easy. When we move to the suburbs and we have poverty and we have kids who can benefit from Head Start, but we have more working poor, even though they may be in poverty, that this 17-17 5-classroom model all in one space doesn't work. Yeah. It needs to be melded with child care so that it can be full day, full year. It's less dispersed. And we may want to have a model where Head Start can work, not 100% poverty kids, all in one location. So, and then this plays out in housing, it plays out in healthcare, it plays out in human services. So it's not, I think that this is a great thing when we encourage diversity and mixed income communities, and so that the suburbs are not all rich and the city is all poor. I think nobody here would disagree with that. But what we need is a policy environment and a build-up of infrastructure in the suburbs to support that overall policy.
Anybody else want to get in on that one?
Well, I think it really just goes back to what I was trying to express earlier, of the need for every neighborhood to be organized in a way that allows people to connect to opportunity, get an education for their children. And these are not, we're talking about either or. Either it's inner city, and either, if you're poor, really, you're looking for a set of things that are very similar. And people, you know, there's a tendency as we're talking to make it sound like we get to decide where people live, right? Oh, well, we think there are too many of them here and we'll put them here. Actually, people make very rational decisions about where can I afford some housing, where might it be the safest, where are the opportunities for my child to get an education. This is what they're thinking about. So it's a matter of, this is a human capital moment too. Can I say that? Really, it's about investing in people. It's not about curing problems or fixing broken. It's about investing in people, wherever they may be, so that they can take advantage of these opportunities that are being created. And that is just a bridge we have yet to fully cross in the way we fund and the way we think. And then locking funding down further to geography, demographics, and even a specific kind of site or building doesn't allow us to use whatever hard capital has already been invested in the building. Let's repurpose it. Whatever resources, in all of the neighborhoods we serve, 400,000 people a year, still 90% and above car dependent. So that has to be a factor. You have to figure that into any equation that says we're wanting to support folks. So it's just about taking the money and looking at the resources and the opportunities available and building the locally sensitive, taking advantage of what's already there response. And that's what we dream of again and again and again, and 10 different ways of saying it, but allow us to use what's available, repurpose it, shift it, combine it in new ways so that it works.
Yeah, and I'm struck by the fact that you sort of have 3 things that you think matter, and you have 3 things that, it is really, you're just keeping your eye on a limited number of balls to try to deliver for the communities, whether they're suburban or urban, doesn't really matter. Now, let me take one more brief question so that we can move to our keynote speaker.
It sounds to me like the IFF is doing social entrepreneurship, but I'm not sure. And if not, is this being considered as a way of bringing in money on a continuous basis as opposed to depending on donations and government money?
Well, so the money that IFF brings in is for things. We invest in, we would invest in Angela all day long and every day. But it's more on the tangible assets like child care centers and health clinics and charter schools and human services facilities and equipment. So that's the capital that we are bringing in. But what we also try to do is organize foundation and government support of our nonprofit clients in ways that help them be more efficient in the suburbs or to do things smarter in the cities too.
Yeah, Angela, is that something
you
want to think about?
Just a quick thought on that. There are the different character of money. Government money is always going to be more restrictive, more prescriptive, and slower to evolve and move to the local communities. And decisions are made about it from a distance. So some of the newer models that are emerging in the social entrepreneurship arena are so powerful because they are responsive. That is evolutionary money. That's the money that comes in. That's a dollar that doesn't already have a little tag on it that says you must spend it here this way for this particular service. So I think in addition to having public policy change to recognize the value of flexibility at the local level, having every nonprofit institution look at those sources of funding that give you more breathing room It used to be that some foundations would play that role. Unfortunately, too many foundations have actually moved into sort of a bureaucratic model that resembles federal policy almost. And so I think nonprofits have to look for the entrepreneurial money so that you can be responsive in a
having
quick
an
time frame.
outcome tag. You talked about tags. It's like if government, the programs I was talking about, government has an outcome tag.
Yeah.
It's here's what we want.
Right.
Here's some things that generally have to guide you getting there. Guide you, not prescribe you.
Prescribe you.
That's the revolutionary money, because we're okay with guides, but it's this outcome space. And I agree, foundations have got more into the wanting specific outputs. Let's talk about the outputs, and we get away from the outcomes. So that more and more of this government or foundations giving it an outcome tag is really what we're after.
Results.
Just very quickly, innovation. We keep hearing a lot about that. What we're doing is innovative, but you're talking about risk-averse systems that we're trying to do innovation in. So if you want the innovation, you have to be willing to take that risk, that whether it's in an organization like Angela's or Joe's, or if it's in schools, let us do it. You have to, if we want to be STEM smart, a lot of people who are dealing with sciences, failure is a part of it. That's how you get creativity and innovation, and you have to be, you can't have these conflicting things going on where you say you want this, but we're not going to provide an environment where you can.
Failing forward is the current term, and our boss Bruce likes to talk about this is the inevitable result of when you let your federal agencies be run by the Inspector General's offices, because they don't have they're not the most risk tolerant of entities. So we're going to move on to the keynote at this point. I'm so grateful to Joe and Mary and Angela for taking time out to be here today. Join me in thanking them.